I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Muriam Fancy, and I am a AI ethics researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, as well as a Master's of Global Affairs student. So now my slides should be sharing, so that's fantastic. And I'm going to speak to you today about the governance of ethical AI methodologies to procure low-risk AI for public use. And the reasoning of why I find this to be such an important topic is because truly governments have the primary role in determining the limitations of behavior for how public services act with the public. And in the case of artificial intelligence, it's often very difficult to determine the way in which it's going to behave, especially on a national scale. And if we take Canada as an example, with our population being dynamic and diverse as it is, which is an absolutely lovely characteristic that I'm very proud to have being a visitor in Canada. But it is important to take into consideration who is using these AI systems, and therefore what are the harms and risks that these systems would pose for these populations. And so before I get started, I want to just note that the primary stakeholders that we're going to be talking about today are governments and the public. Governments, as I mentioned, regulate public services, and the public utilizes these services. And it's up to the government to control the limitations of these behaviors. And the main concern is that if citizens are unaware of how these AI systems are being deployed, it is difficult for them to have agency over their data and how they're being used in these systems. So as I mentioned before, I'm a final year graduate of the Masters of Global Affairs program. I also did my undergraduate degree at U of T in Peace, Conflict, and Justice with a double minor in Indigenous Studies and Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And I would argue that although I do not have like a technical background in the realm of tech, I really appreciate how my bachelor's degree as well as my master's degree has been helping me understand different nuanced societal thinking of approaching these technologies. For my AI ethics work, I'm a researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, in which majority of my work is surrounding regulation and governance of AI, but always with a focus on the human rights implications of these AI systems. Additionally, at the Center for Law, Technology, and Society, I am the research coordinator for the AI and Society Initiative, as well as at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. I am on the AI Ethics Advisory Group, in which we're working with the Secretary of CC UNESCO, as well as a series of national AI experts to speak about how AI ethics, AI can be used to accomplish the SDGs in Canada. So what is artificial intelligence? How do we define it? Before I go into that, I would like to note that this presentation is meant to be an introduction into how AI regulation and governance occurs. I wish I had more time, but I want to just give you all a framework and an understanding of what role AI plays in our lives. But the reasoning why I chose a definition by an industry partner instead of, let's just say, a certain community group or a governance definition. And that's because we're going to be talking about how governments are actually procuring AI systems from corporations such as IBM or other startups. So understanding a nuanced definition from an industry perspective is very important. And so IBM defines artificial intelligence as any human-like intelligence exhibited by a computer, robot, or other machine. In popular usage, artificial intelligence refers to the ability of a computer or machine to mimic the capabilities of the human mind. So artificial intelligence can be used in so many capacities. I want to give 3 case examples in which how it's being used in the public. First is insurance. So artificial intelligence is generally used as a prediction model based off of a series of multitudes of data, which I will go into later on, the importance of understanding how data is being accessed and the type of data that is being used. But in regards to public use, oftentimes insurance companies will gather large amounts of consumer data, which will lead to an increase in automation for, let's just say, predicting insurance rate, understanding who their customer base is, and just overall automating the system, which will lead to a high income rate for the company. Next is policing and justice systems. So artificial intelligence, unfortunately, is used quite often in these systems. And the reasons why I say unfortunately, because oftentimes they cause a lot more harm than benefit, if there is any benefit. And that is because artificial intelligence systems often are fed biased data or are used incorrectly against marginalized communities, which leads to really discriminatory rulings. And the way in which they're used in policing and justice systems are through risk assessments of, let's just say, those who have been charged, and predictive policing. So again, that is so dependent upon the way in which data is gathered and scraped, and who is then utilizing these systems in the policing and justice system. And finally, HR. HR utilizes artificial intelligence systems from rating candidates to reading the language in resumes through machine learning. And oftentimes, depending again upon how these systems are built, the way in which they define successful candidates, what the type of language they're looking for to determine who is successful, this leads to discriminatory understandings of the candidate itself and leading to biased decision making. But what's the role of the government in this? Well, the government has a responsibility for creating guiding principles. If any of you in the audience know a little bit about Canada's regulation for artificial intelligence, which I'll actually demonstrate as a case example today, is that governments have the responsibility to really have a set of core principles that guide their actions about how they are procuring AI, how they define AI, how they understand artificial intelligence systems in public use, and then what are the core value systems. And I'll also give this as an example later on. I'm giving a lot of foresight into this presentation, but Singapore's the Singapore governance system for artificial intelligence, referencing their national strategy, they list ethics and social good as principal values for their guiding principles of how they approach artificial intelligence, both within the nation when they are building these systems, but also how they procure it from startups or other industries. So defining the use of AI is very important because that definition is going to determine how they automate and how they predict, as two example cases. Next is really the stakeholder industry role, and it's generally the government that can define the limitations of behaviors of these two stakeholders. It's government approved businesses and how they define which agencies are safe, are developing artificial intelligence systems that have a role in the public or in their state, or defining what is necessary. The government has that capability. And finally, it's accountability. So accountability is a really big mechanism that needs to be emphasized. And the reasoning for that is that it's through accountability that issues of risk and safety can be at the forefront. Accountability often is tied to transparency, but they're two very different methodologies. Transparency will allow us to understand as public citizens who is building these systems, how are they defining the problem that these systems are trying to solve, where are they gathering the data. And so if the government does not put issues of transparency and accountability at the forefront, it makes it very difficult to protect the needs and the wants of the public, but also the unintended or intended harms. So I slightly went into this previously, but the significance of understanding governance mechanisms for procuring ethical AI and low risk AI for public use is that, again, we're working with a technology that is very much human dependent. If people end up saying that artificial intelligence takes an objective view for whatever issue they're tackling, it's not correct. Artificial intelligence is built by people. It should be used as a tool, not as a single system metric of truth or a single ledger of truth, as our own biases and our own understanding of the world ends up being automated within these systems. So harms, biases, discrimination ends up being put through these systems, but it's up to us to have a human intervention through accountability to really ensure that we can limit the behavior of these systems. Next is public awareness. Oftentimes, governments don't place a large significance on public awareness or public literacy on these emerging technologies. And the reasoning why it's so important is because unless the public is aware of what artificial intelligence is, how it's being used with them or against them, or in what services are they accessing that utilizes artificial intelligence, it's going to be really difficult for public citizens to make a claim for whether they've been harmed by these systems. And so I'll speak later on for recommendations about how to really maneuver in this space, but consultations are one really incredible way to increase public awareness. And finally, accountability. Are there tools and resources in place to hold the government accountable if harm is caused? And the reason why, again, I'll put a lot of emphasis on this is because it's really difficult to hold large bodies and stakeholders like governments or large corporations accountable if harm is caused, and also quantifying such harm is really difficult if they don't have access to the data, or they don't have access or understanding of what is occurring. And so it's truly working in a system, a cyclical system that needs to be put together in order to ensure transparency and accountability. And so those are some reasons why this is such a significant topic. So I wanted to give a case study to speak about how AI, in this case with the UK government, actually procured a very flawed AI system and what were the impacts of it. So there was a case that the UK federal government deployed this flawed AI algorithm that disproportionately impacted students who took A-level courses. So students were assigned a grade based on historical data, and those discrepancies between the teachers assessing them versus the historical data that was put into place wasn't really taken into account. And then that led to students' grades being impacted, lowered at times, or increased and inflated to a rate that they shouldn't have been. And so many students were disproportionately affected, and it impacted their rates of university admissions. And this was a great cause for concern because the algorithm did not properly represent the students that were being accounted for in this AI system. So this is a great case example to demonstrate what I mentioned before. It's people that are building these systems. It's people that are putting forward their biases or not properly scraping data, or not talking to the public before launching such systems. And so despite the public and students being outraged from the impact of this flawed algorithm, there hasn't been much accountability for the students who were hurt in the process of utilizing these systems, and the UK government hasn't done much to account for the harms that were done. And so this, again, like, this is just a case example demonstrating that if a government doesn't properly understand the methodologies in order to procure low risk systems and go through an iterative design process of understanding the impact of these systems specifically on youth, and youth are not really spoken about, especially in data scraping, or like the impact of marginalized communities are often not going to be properly shown in the data that's being used for these systems. And when that leads to zero accountability, what are these students left with? Well, they're left with the consequence that they're facing today, and that's possibly lower grades, that's possibly not having admission to university, and that's also not knowing where to go from there. I wanted to follow up with an example by the Canadian government, and that is on the algorithmic impact assessment. So this is through the direct on automated decision making. And so the whole purpose of this is that they use this impact assessment in order to measure the risk of AI systems before they're deployed. So before this slide is happening right before I go into the methodologies of certain actions that governments should take before procuring artificial intelligence. I think this is a really good example of a tool that a government is using to understand and measure the impact of artificial intelligence. And I'll just review quickly what the algorithmic impact assessment actually says. And so it goes over 5 different principles, and that's understanding and measuring the impact of the use of AI before deploying it. So what developed these systems, what's in the design of these systems, the importance of transparency, as I mentioned before, who is using this, what is the clear use of these systems in the public. Next is providing a meaningful explanation about how these systems are making decisions. So what are the challenges that these systems are facing when making decisions? And I mentioned before, and this is not readily spoken about as much as I would hope, and I'm sure other AI ethics researchers would hope, is that AI shouldn't be the final stop in making decisions, but rather humans should always be in the loop. Next is be open, as they say, quote unquote, I'm quoting what the government has to say here. These are not my own words, but be as open as we can by sharing source code, training data, and other relevant information. Again, that goes to the previous point that I made of the importance of having access to the type of data that they're using to understand inclusivity, understand which biases are taking into place, to understand who are they actually accounting for. Is everybody being accounted for? Is that even possible? And if that is not possible, is it safe to actually deploy these systems? And that's why transparency is so important. And the last point is providing sufficient training so that government employees developing and using AI solutions have responsible design, function, and implementation skills. And I'll talk about why this is so important, because there is such a large knowledge gap between policymakers and technical experts when developing and deploying these systems. And that often leads to deploying unethical, flawed AI. But those are 5 main principles that have developed the algorithmic impact assessment in Canada. It's not perfect, but it's one of the first few iterative designs that I've seen of a government really taking procurement from an ethical perspective and really trying to make sure that they go through a certain series of steps. So I wanted to talk about a series of methodologies, which is the whole point of today's talk, to talk about methodologies for how to procure low-risk AI for public use. I want to preface this with a few things first. One, again, this is an introductory talk. This isn't meant to be in-depth in explaining a step-by-step process that governments would go through. I tried to put it in a series of logical steps that would make sense, but there's a lot more that's coming up and this field is ever evolving. So I wanted to say that first. Second, I also think that sometimes these methodologies can be industry dependent, depending on how they're used in public services. So this is very much a general overview of what I have seen, what I've been trying to research, and really how to ensure that inclusivity, diversity, and safety is at the forefront. And finally, I think that there is a very big difference between harm and risk. That's a very contentious topic in the AI ethics realm because quantifying harm and risk is quite difficult, but I'll try my best to go into that today. So first is talking about defining the problem and gap that's needed. What's the problem that actually needs to be filled with these AI systems? And the reason why I think that's an important first step is because maybe artificial intelligence doesn't actually have a place there. Maybe it wasn't necessary to deploy AI to fill that gap or that need. Maybe there was another way, another policy, or another emerging technology that could have be put into place to solve or really tackle this gap in need. So defining that problem is the first step. Second is a public role and impact. So understanding that, okay, if we have taken into consideration that, okay, that we think that artificial intelligence can fill this gap or this need or support it in whatever way that the government sees necessary, understanding who is going to be involved in accessing these services and then therefore feeling the effects of artificial intelligence is really important to lay out at the very beginning, because as I mentioned before, depending on which state and this is going to be deployed in, norms need to be taken into place, governance systems need to be taken into place, and also the demographic of the public needs to be considered. So really, what are the sectors that would be adopting this technology, and at what scale would this need to occur? So you can understand the impact of regulating it later on. Next is regulating policies. Are there policies in place to regulate the behavior of these systems? If there's not regulatory policies, then that is where most governments face a barrier. As I mentioned before, regulation is so necessary in order to ensure that unethical or flawed AI doesn't have the intended or unintended harms to the public that it would do if there's not frameworks put into place to limit the behavior of these AI systems. So regulating policies are very important, and really having some sort of digital framework from a governance perspective is what needs to be considered here. Next is knowledge mobilization from both the policy and the public. So understanding the role that policy can play and what is the level of AI literacy for the public. So once you have understood the gap, once you've understood who is going to be using these systems and in what sectors are going to be adopted in, are there policies in place to actually regulate and monitor the AI systems? It's important to understand how policy will actually behave once the system is deployed. So foresight design is really important here, and UX design. So it are two really important methodologies that need to be taken into place when it comes to knowledge mobilization. And if there is not a certain level of AI literacy, I would argue, and I'm sure other major stakeholders in the space would agree, that the government really needs to invest in hosting public consultations, making information on these systems more accessible to increase literacy so that the public can be aware of how their data is being used and what is the role of their agency once these systems are deployed. Next is accessible, ethical, and safe data. Data has a really big role in artificial intelligence systems because they truly make up how the predictive design model is going to be working. And based off of what the algorithm is asking or looking for, the data is going to be really filling in that answer. So if the data doesn't represent the population, doesn't represent the sector that is being deployed in, you'll face a situation like the UK did, where it's using historical data that wasn't inclusive at all, and actually led to a series of, I would argue, generational consequences. And so really defining what the data is, what were the data scraping methods, where is it being sourced from, are really important. And I would say that's one of the many steps where bias and discrimination can come into play. And it actually could happen in any of the steps that I've mentioned on this slide. Next is mapping unintended and intended harms and risks. Who's going to be harmed? What are the risks? Is the industry at risk? Is the industry able to support the use of these systems? A pre-acquisition review is really necessary. And I learned about pre-acquisition reviews from AI Now. They have a really great paper about this. And if I'll try my best to do a short summary about it, but essentially what it's asking is that if a pre-acquisition review is going to be asking whether the industry or the corporation or the startup, whatever the case is, that the government is actually procuring the artificial intelligence from, have they mapped out what their intended harms are, or have they mapped out the potential risks? And so I would hope that a pre-acquisition review would happen much sooner than this, but I would also think that at this stage in which the slide is at is when governments would be thinking about which corporation they want to procure the artificial intelligence from. But a pre-acquisition review will definitely source some of the questions about intended and unintended harms, but it's really important, which I didn't write on the slide, but I'm saying it now, is a risk assessment is made. And so by hosting that risk assessment, I would hope that if it's demonstrated that there are substantially more risks than there are benefits, that whoever is in charge of procuring the system would actually start at the very beginning and seeing if maybe they got a step wrong, or maybe they're really not looking at the problem from the right perspective. But risk assessments are so important because not most governments, most corporations, even universities who are using these systems, or whatever stakeholder, are not doing a risk assessment. And that's when we land at the UK government case study. Diverse team and diverse options. So the team that's deploying the AI system should be diverse, and there should be diversity in the companies that these governments are looking for. By really narrowing down on a certain set of companies, you're limiting how these problems are going to be approached. You're limiting the understanding of the impacts of these AI systems. And so diversity at every level is so important, but it's really important that there's a diversity in both thought, in the type of people that are being included in the deployment of these systems. So I mentioned this earlier, but there's a big knowledge gap between policy experts and technical experts. And so ensuring that both types of individuals are on these teams is really important. And there's a diversity in the types of industries that they're procuring their AI from. Next, accountability mechanisms. Okay, so I did go into this more. So, and that's on risk assessment framework. So accountability isn't accomplished through risk assessment, but through risk assessment, we can understand who will be looking for accountability, if that makes sense. And accountability mechanisms, I would say risk assessment is a tool that can be used in the process of figuring out how to create accountability, but really, is there going to be a system in place that can support the public if they are facing the harms and risks from these AI systems? Is there a way, if, for example, if they're financially or socially damaged or facing these harms, is there a way that they can be reimbursed, or they can just like take up their consequences with someone? And if there's not accountability mechanisms put into place, again, referencing the UK study, you're going to have the case of the students who didn't know where to turn to, really facing the short end of the stick. So accountability is so important. And I don't want to go too deep into it because that could be a whole talk on its own, but I really implore all of you to look into the importance of accountability. Finally, it's the second last step, sorry, is procurement and ethical, procurement from an ethical and transparent standpoint. So like I mentioned before, guiding principles on what is ethical and what is transparent, in ensuring that norms of transparency are seen from both sides, both the government and from the organization or stakeholder that they're procuring the artificial intelligence from. Because if it's viewed on one side, just because the government may be valuing transparency, that doesn't mean that the organization that they're procuring the system from does. And if certain regulations or methodologies are not taken into place, that is how harm is going to occur. So ensuring that both sides have norms of transparency, what is considered as ethical AI is heard from both sides. And if those definitions and guiding frameworks and principles are not involved in the design of these systems, I would really hope that the government would start at the very beginning and look again to see what are some other options of who they can procure these AI systems from. Next is public support, consultations, and knowledge. And I'll talk about this in the next slide, but this shouldn't be the final step. It's really important to include the public at all stages. And again, this is not a step-by-step guide on how governance for AI should work, but these are really important methodologies that I think should be taken into account. So public support, consultation, and knowledge, which we'll talk about in the next stage. But again, I do want to say that this is an iterative process of procurement. Iteration is so important to understand and to really take into fact that at the first step, it's not going to be done properly because we really need to map out what the consequences are, what are the benefits, what are the harms, what are the risks, how is it designed, where the data is coming from. Asking these questions are so important. And if they're not properly taken into account with equal weight, we're going to face negative consequences, and we're going to be deploying unethical AI and flawed AI. So next I'll go into how to protect the public. public consultations are so important. And the reason why I say this is because the government, although is representing the public, might not always know what the public wants. Taking a human-centered approach to governance is so important, and a user-centric approach is so important that one of the only ways to do that is by including the public, which seems obvious but isn't really done. So concerns regarding AI, automation, discrimination, or access needs to be heard. Again, this needs to be done in the pre-acquisition review. Really, I would say this should be done at the first step of when they're defining the problem and seeing what the public thinks at every stage. Next is investment in education. Access to knowledge on AI and the role it plays is so important in public awareness. I would say that if the public doesn't have an understanding of what artificial intelligence is and what the impact it can be, it's going to be really difficult for the public to have a footing and to understand how either their identity or their data is being used in these systems. So really ensuring that there's accessible access to education for the public to know how to act in society or how to understand their role when these AI systems are being deployed. Next is a knowledge and communication gap. There's a really large knowledge gap between technical experts and policy experts. And this leads to, again, I'll reference the UK case study. It's clear that the governance methodology there did not review discriminatory or the impacts of discriminatory algorithms, did not probably review what was being taken into consider of those algorithms. How was that algorithm being designed? And that's because oftentimes policy experts don't have this technical knowledge, but technical experts do. But technical experts are not often seen or heard in policy realms. And so bridging the knowledge and communication gap between these two stakeholders is so important to ensure that the needs and the concerns from the public are heard and are taken into account at every iterative level of design for governance methodologies. I just wanted to quickly reference, because I know I'm hitting 30 minutes, quickly reference two other frameworks that I would suggest everybody here take a look at, and that's the OECD framework on AI principles, as well as the Singapore governance model for their national AI strategy. Although the Singapore government national AI strategy, again, like I wouldn't say any governance strategy is perfect or it's one that should be seen in every single government. But I do think it's a really interesting framework because they list AI ethics and social good as some guiding principles at the very beginning, and it's a really interesting model. So I would suggest everybody here take a look at those frameworks. And that's all that I have for you today. Thank you.